Hello, my wonderful, beautiful friends. Welcome back to another episode of r/ProRevenge, where in today's episode, you'll hear two stories. The first, OP deals with neighbors that make his family miserable. And the second story, OP gets a revenge on his parents, which is always fun to listen to, my friends. Guys, I do hope you enjoyed today's stories, and do hit that subscribe button for future tales, if you're new here. As we found out we'd be expecting not one, but two kids, we knew we had to move to a real house with more space. At the time, we were still living in a one-bedroom studio, one up from the ground floor, with its only entrance being a metal fire escape. It was not ideal for pregnant women, let alone to live with two small babies. We found a privately leased house that was newly renovated, and it had all the room and a large garden we were looking for. We signed the lease and immediately collected the keys. As the owner drove off, the woman next door comes up to me, immediately demanding that we not make noise before noon. Her boyfriend works nights and sleeps in a whole bunch. She also pretty much gave me a whole list of do's and don'ts, so right off the bat, we knew that there was trouble incoming. As the house was fully renovated and not much had to be done, we were like, don't poke the bear. We'll do things that make noise after noon. We moved in after 2 weeks, and the whole street was warm and welcoming. My wife was almost due giving birth to my twin daughters, and some offered help with anything we needed. They were real kind people. They also told us about our neighbors, how nobody liked them and that he was a big bully and often got into arguments with everybody. Also, they were known as radio pirates, as in illegal broadcasting on radio with no license. Another thing we found out is that Thursday to Sunday till 5 in the morning, they would party. Loud music, constant yelling, always drunk, etc. Really something to look forward to when moving in, certainly with two babies on the way. The partying began immediately in full blast, and we're thinking, that's real classy for someone demanding us to be quiet. Then one day, my father-in-law comes to put new grass in. He has his trailer parked at the back of our house, which is public space. Not according to our neighbor though. No. That exact spot where the trailer was parked was his spot, and we had to move the trailer. Not gonna happen, as I wasn't planning to walk all the way around the house with sod. He gets angry right away and demanded I move it, and I told him to go screw himself. I was done with him then and there. I'm also a ginger, so besides having no soul, I do have a temper, which is always in check until you provoke me repeatedly. We went on working, and at the end of the day comes and my father-in-law wants to leave. He hooks up the trailer and bam, there was the idiot neighbor, telling him off, yelling that it's his spot and he better not do this again or else. Now, one thing about me is you can mess with me all you want. I can handle it. But what you don't do is threaten my family. I ran outside and told him in no uncertain terms to back off or he'll be the sorry one. Now, it was a total bluff on my side, and yes, I do have that temper, but I'm not impressively built and have no hidden fighting skills. He backs off and father-in-law leaves, and I go inside where I find my wife crying. She got scared that he was gonna do something to her father or me, and that's something we don't need right now. So I'm even more pissed, but had to promise her not to act on anything. So time goes on without any real incident, and then comes the time my wife goes into labor. It didn't go so smooth, and we ended up having to deliver with C-section. We had to stay 3 nights, 3 excruciating nights due to a lot of things. Finally, we get to go home. The family had put a giant sign in our front yard welcoming the babies. The sign was already up for a few days prior to coming home, so our friendly neighbors definitely knew about it. But did they give a care in the world? No. No, they did not. From the very first night, they started to party and broad-blasted their terror music. They would begin at noon and continued until 5 or 6 in the morning. Classy. They also kept going for days, so it wasn't just Thursday to Sunday. It was all week long, and then the next. So we were broken and we hardly slept. I just had it. I researched some things on radio pirates and laws and regulations on his large 5-meter antenna in his backyard, which was illegal in itself. But he also used it to illegally broadcast on radio, which meant he had a lot of equipment to do so, which was even more illegal and can even get you jailed. At the very least, they could seize it all and fine him big time, in the $10,000 to $45,000 area. Now, I did not immediately turn him in, but instead was looking for another house to lease first. This is because I figured it wouldn't sit well with him, and having a wife and 2 babies in the house alone during the day when I went to work made me a little uneasy. Now, I can hear you guys thinking, why not involve the police? Well, they are utterly useless in cases like this. We called once, and what they did disturbs me to this day. They rang at their doorbell and immediately started off by saying that we called them about noise complaints. Yep, you read that right. There was no protection whatsoever. They just blatantly told them that we were the reason they're here, and told them to keep it down, and that was it. As you can guess, our neighbor now was even more pissed off and told me the next day, or yelled over the fence that separates our backyard, that I really should not do that again. A threat of which I told the police, but without witnesses to corroborate, nothing could be done yet again. So some days later, I walked out the front door and he just stepped out of his car. He came up to me demanding I cut some of our ivy that grew on our side of the fence because it tangled in with his big ass antenna. He told me he'd be gone for some hours and I can come into his garden to cut back the ivy that grew through on their side. And then, a light bulb went on above my head. I told him politely that I would do that immediately. Why? Because that gave me the opportunity to find out the make and model of his antenna, and where the cables go exactly, what kind of cables they were, and again, to know the signal strength it handled. Also, it gave me a good view on the equipment he had. So through the window, I could snap some photographs of it. This was the icing on the cake. In the meantime, we did manage to find a new home and already had signed the lease, so we would be gone in 2 weeks. So after I trimmed the ivy and collected my evidence, I went online that night to find out the proper channels to report a broadcast pirate and which entity was tasked with catching said pirate. It turns out I had to call the telecom agency, but also the police. So I gave both the agency and the police all the evidence I collected, and I pointed them to the frequencies he pirated so they could listen in. They began a neighborhood investigation, which wasn't really necessary, but this was to cover our asses, to make it look like he got caught by accident because they had an active investigation in the area. We asked them to wait with the raid, and yes, they do raid pirates' houses. We moved 2 weeks later, and they raided him 2 days after we moved. The police swarmed in, and all of his equipment, computers, radios, cell phones, and his car were seized. He left in cuffs, and his wife or girlfriend did too, for making a big scene and trying to interfere. All of which was live reported to me by one of my ex-neighbors, who were equally ecstatic about this. So it turns out that this was not the first time he got caught, but his third time. His car also had no insurance on it. This would normally have no big consequence because he didn't drive it while raided, but they had the guy surveilled on for a week, and that definitely meant he was seen driving it while not having insurance. So in the end, he was fined somewhere around 30,000 euros. He went to jail for 12 weeks and everything was seized and destroyed, except the car. His girlfriend had to do 40 hours of community service. They also had to sell the house, which made for very happy neighbors as they too were over and done with them. Over a year later, when shopping groceries, I encountered them. They gave me the foulest of looks. Now, if looks could kill, I'd be a smoldering heap of ash. Like I said, I do fight, but very dirty. You really have to make an effort for me to get to that point. They did, and they suffered. Listen guys, it's so amazing how many problems can be avoided by just being kind to your neighbors. Now obviously, I'm not saying to let a pirate get away with illegal activity. What I'm saying is that I've read so many of these stories, and far too often, people living in glass houses throw the most stones and often the biggest stones. With that said though, I'm so glad OP executed that wonderful revenge safely. The neighborhood sounds like it's a much better place now. Background. So back when I was 15, I had a father who we'll call Deadbeat Joe. Deadbeat Joe was the stereotypical deadbeat father, as he almost never contacted me of his own volition, and he resisted paying my mother's child support. My mother, being the saint she was, never talked bad about him, and tried to endorse a relationship between us throughout my entire childhood. Now, I did love Deadbeat Joe, and would often want to spend time with him, but to no avail because he was always getting busy with some rather questionable women. So I was basically forgotten about by him until the few occasions when he realized that he remembered that he did have an older son. Because of that, I was raised by my mother and my stepfather, who I'll call Dad. They really loved and still do love me, and they worked hard to make sure I was well cared for and provided for. Unfortunately, me and my family had to move away to another state when I was 12, which meant that my parents ended up buying a house which we moved into. Now, something to mention up to this point was that we were very poor, and my parents ended up buying a house after getting a great deal for it. However, the house was and still is very poor quality, and my parents didn't know that, so we ended up basically getting scammed. My mother lost her job, and over time, we ended up becoming so poor that we had to rely on food banks to survive. Luckily, or rather unluckily, Deadbeat Joe and his new wife, who we'll call Chris, said they'd take me in. They had a good, decent quality of life. I went to go live with Deadbeat Joe and Chris, plus their kids, due to the fact that my real parents were about to lose our home at the time, and they did not want me to be homeless along with them. At first, they were very welcoming, but after a few weeks, things started to change. Both Chris and Deadbeat Joe had lied, and they were just as poor as my parents were. Over time, Chris had started to show the volatile side of herself, and Deadbeat Joe had found out that I was gay, which was a problem, due to the fact that he was very Christian. They both really hated how I was, and felt that I needed mental help, because he felt that I had some sort of an illness. When I refused to conform, they got very angry. Due to all of this, it caused me a lot of stress and anxiety over the 2 months I stayed there. I would cry a lot in my room, wishing that the fuses that kept breaking would set the house on fire and take me with it. After a while, the hostility in the house built up, and I would eventually be falsely accused of looking up explicit things on Chris's phone. Deadbeat Joe ended up taking my phone away and threatening me with knives, which resulted in me taking my phone back and running away to hide in the bushes outside of the trailer park we lived in. The cops came, and my parents manipulated the situation to make it seem like I was a terrible child, and they left. Next week was a living hell afterwards, as Chris and Deadbeat Joe kept trying to get a confession out of me and kept threatening me, but I held my ground and was able to leave their house and move back in with my parents. By this point, I was seething with rage, but I didn't do anything to them as I wanted to move on. However, a month after I left the house, I remembered that smug look on Chris's face when she was making my life miserable. I decided that I hated her too much to not retaliate against her and her husband. So that's what I ended up doing. I decided that I would sign Chris up for all the spam and junk mail I could find, using the information I could find online and on the school directory that she worked at. Looking to hear the sacred word of Scientology? Click. Want to hear about our crappy products that will fall apart after one use? Click. Want to see some hot women get it on with each other? Click, click, click. Next, I decided to send Chris's family some recordings I took of the things that she would say to me. During my stay at Chris's house, I had recorded all the things she was saying to me, so I had evidence to show my parents that she was in fact abusing me. I ended up sending those recordings to all of her close friends and family before blocking them. Lastly, I decided that I would continue to make Deadbeat Joe pay my mother for what he owed her in child support. I was originally going to ask my real dad to adopt me, but after learning how much money Deadbeat Joe had to send my mother, which was around $1,200 a month, I did the math and concluded out of spite that I would let my mother keep on milking him for what he was worth, until I turned 18. It's going to be quite some time before I become an adult, so by the time I turned 18, he'll have to legally pay my mother around $25,000, which is definitely not something to sniff at. So I never did hear back from my evil parents after I carried out my revenge against them, so I don't really know their immediate reaction towards what I done. However, going back through the school directory to see if any changes were made to it, I discovered that almost all the teachers' info was scrubbed from the site, and my stepmother's name was nowhere to be found. I connected the dots, and it made me realize that I had caused an entire site-wide change. And the reason that I never heard back from my parents was because of how badly I'd humiliated Chris, and I knew Chris would have flogged Deadbeat Joe if he dared try to talk to me again. After realizing this, I laughed so hard. I'm studying for an exam that will earn me certification in design, which is important for the field I want to get into. I'm taking my education seriously, and now I have opportunities that I wouldn't have been afforded if I'd stayed at Chris's house. I've made some new friends and now have moved on from the things that my parents did to me. And that, my friends, brings us to another end of our /ProRevenge. Guys, if you enjoyed today's stories, do remember to hit that thumbs up. If you missed the last episode of our /ProRevenge, and I know it's been a while, I will link it right here. OP has a vandal who tries to mess with his car, and the revenge is oh so sweet. Do check it out if you haven't, and I'll see you guys in the next one. I love you.